All right, so if you'll remember from a couple weeks back, we had opened up in Genesis chapter 1, and we're looking at verse 25 and 26. 26 and 27, that is. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle of the earth, over every creeping thing. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female created he them. So my question was, what does this mean to be made in God's image? So a couple weeks back, we looked at the Hebrew terms for image and likeness. And just by way of summary, there were two key questions that I had, really. Do image and likeness strictly mean just physical appearance, what God looks like, right? He's speaking with the angels, let us make man in our image and likeness. So God and the angels, they have some sort of appearance, perhaps, and is that what's being spoken of here, or is there a range of meaning to these terms? And then the second question being, do they essentially mean the same thing? Are they referring to the same thing? Are they terms that are used interchangeably? The terms being image and likeness. So I think we had reviewed a quote from John Thomas saying that image refers to the form of man, what he looks like, and likeness appears to his moral character, how he's like God. And so that was Brother Thomas's suggestion. I think Brother Thomas, in the context in Elpis Israel, he's very concerned to make the point that neither image nor likeness mean nature, right? So when we talk about the divine nature, that's something else altogether. That's something that man does not have. So that seems to be his primary point. But he says, the form of man, he does appear like God in some sense. When God comes to Abraham on the plains of Mamre, there's three angels there, and they appear just like men. That's John Thomas's point. I want to look at how the prophets experienced God, and also what Scripture says about what God looks like. So there's this may not be something that we spend a whole lot of time thinking about, but there's a lot of language in Scripture that speaks of God in human terms. I'll give you a few examples. And you can probably think of many more. This is just a very kind of beginner's list. The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their cry. So God has eyes, he has vision to see things. He has ears to hear things. The question in my mind is, and that, we survey the whole list of references there. Clearly, it's talking about God as if he has these body parts with functions that we know and recognize because we have ears and eyes and mouths and feet, and they all serve a purpose. And then, interestingly enough, this purpose is so essentially tied to how we experience life, the body parts that we have almost take on a metaphorical meaning, right? So, the expression, lend me your ear, right? If we were to think about that expression in very literal terms, it would be absurd. Here's my ear. Give it back when you're done. The mouth of the Lord has spoken, Isaiah 1 verse 20. My heart says to you, seek his face. Your face, Lord, I will seek, in Psalm 27. Here's one. The sea is his, for he made it. His hands formed the dry land. So our hands are used for our actions in many senses, right? Even something that is not directly done with the hands. Somebody might say, give me a hand. Here's my hand. No, it means help me with something. So hands represent God's actions, his creative works. I think what's important to remember when we're doing this, reading the Bible, and we see these kinds of references to God, we have to remember, God is not a man, right? But because we are men and women, he speaks to us in ways that we understand. He speaks in ways that are relatable. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? I think of the expression, the long arm of the law, right? You've heard that before? right? And the idea is, that the law, law enforcement agencies have a very long reach to apprehend criminals, right? You can flee to whatever distant part, and somehow the FBI is going to find you, apprehend you, extradite you, and judge you, right? All that stuff will still happen. So that does not require that law enforcement agencies have a corporeal being, right? This term corporeal means like relating to your body, your flesh, kind of a physical element. So a lot of the people that I was reading use that term to describe whether or not God had a corporeal being to him. So nobody would confuse the judicial system as being like a body in some sense, and yet that expression is used. Exodus 31 talks about the finger of God. We use the expression to point the finger at somebody, which basically means to accuse them or to point them out of a crowd, right? It doesn't actually require pointing a finger. You could just say, that person did it without the pointing. So I'm belaboring the point a little bit, but you get the idea. Is because these parts of our bodies are so closely tied to our everyday experience, the body parts themselves take on a metaphorical sense, which then is applied to God. And that helps us understand how God thinks, because I think a big takeaway here is that God very much is a personal being. He exists, and he has feelings, and he does things, he acts in ways that we can understand. And so that's how he's described to us. Of course, he's not like us in so many other ways, and that's, I think, what we need to appreciate as well. Any comments or questions on this? I think this is kind of interesting because it kind of takes some of the literary understanding of the Bible, right? We often think, okay, when the Bible's literal and what's literal and what's symbolic, right? And I think this is a case where we're using literary expressions to understand God better.
Kind of like with his ways are greater than our ways. Like, we understand love, but his love, right, is like, he's just talking about God's love is so much greater than ours that when he wants us to understand it, he often gives us that parent-child relationship.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like Ben, as a new dad, you probably never thought you could love someone so much as Clara, right?
Yeah.
And so that's usually the example he tries to give us, but he's way up there with the love, right? Like, yeah, we understand love, but his love is way up there.
Yeah, I think, the fact that he teaches us with these lessons from everyday life shows that he cares about us. He wants us to get it, right? He's trying to lead us to an understanding of him in ways that are not like totally unattainable to us. Thanks for sharing that. All right. So let me pull up another quote from our community. Brother Duncan Heister wrote a really well-known book called Bible Basics, which has been used extensively in preaching and teaching. And in this section of the book, Brother Duncan's really focused on showing people that God is a personal God, that he's a God that gets us, that he understands us, that we can speak to about our problems, that he's not distant and removed and disinterested. Obviously God is holy. He is so much higher than us, like the love that you're describing, Butch. It's so far removed from us, and yet he condescends to men of low estate, right? He meets us where we are, and that's really Brother Duncan's point in this section. But he says some things about our creation in the image of God. He says, surely that means we can infer something about the real object of which we are but an image. Thus God, whom we reflect, is not something nebulous of which we cannot conceive. So, I kind of get the sense that he's talking about form in the way that Brother John Thomas did, as being kind of that physical representation. Because he goes on to quote Ezekiel 1. Ezekiel 1's pretty interesting because in this chapter, he describes seeing God. Let me find my place here. Ezekiel 1, verse 26. That's the vision with the cherubim and the wheels, and it's very confusing. But it says, above the expanse, over the cherubim's heads, there was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of a throne was the likeness with a human appearance. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And then in Ezekiel 10, he's referring to this vision. These were the living creatures that I saw underneath the God of Israel by the Chebar Canal, and I knew that they were cherubim. Ezekiel 1 specifically describes as being at the Chebar Canal. So chapter 10 is referring back to that vision in chapter 1. And you can see that the relation that the cherubim underneath, the throne, the one with the likeness of a human appearance above the cherubim, enthroned above the cherubim. Chapter 10 makes it explicit that this is talking about the God of Israel. It says that the God of Israel had the likeness with the human appearance. So that's really interesting, right? So Ezekiel, in some sense, was seeing God enthroned. And then Brother Duncan goes on to connect this with Christ's teaching to render, therefore, unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render to God the things that are God's. Remember, Jesus had held up the denarius, and he said, whose image and superscription is on this coin? So Caesar's image is on it, so give it to him. God's image is on you, so give yourself to God. That's Jesus' whole point. So you have, there's not a lot of references to this idea of man being made in God's image and likeness, particularly in the Old Testament. But clearly this is something Jesus is referencing. So Duncan mentions that. Nevertheless, I think even with Jesus doing that, Jesus can teach spiritual lessons about physical objects. So just because the physical coin is in Caesar's image doesn't mean that we are literally in the form of a physical God. So you can kind of see where I'm trying to approach it. I'm trying to understand, well, how am I supposed to think about God who's, omnipotent, omniscient, he's all powerful, he knows everything, he's in all places. When Scripture says, when God says, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool, am I supposed to imagine someplace up where the stars are that God is seated and he's got his feet on the earth? I don't think that's really the intent of a passage like that. It's supposed to show that he is in an exalted place, so these are sort of the things that I'm pondering, trying to understand this. I don't know if it's as intuitive to others that God is not like a physical being, or maybe there is a variety of opinion on that. Does anybody have thoughts or perspectives to share? I've always understood God as sometimes referred to as the eternal spirit, as sort of being everywhere and not being constrained to one specific location or anything like that. So when we speak of God as being enthroned, the idea is that he is reigning as a king, not that he's sitting somewhere. Yeah.
Of God working, so closely with the angels working so closely with God. Like when you think of creation, the angels helped with the creation. So and we also see writings about angels reporting back to God about what they've seen and what they've been doing, or God sending them on like little missions. So when I think of God being everywhere, I think he has the help of the angels to do that.
That's a good point. And so they're an extension of his presence. All right, so I should kind of say at the outset here that this is a topic that I'm learning about and trying to understand. I'm grappling with it myself. So I'm not going to make a whole lot of statements about this is exactly what I think. Right? I'm going to try to review this in somewhat of an open-minded fashion. I want to look at what others have written about this. That's why I was concerned to see what John Thomas and Duncan Heister, and I think I had some Harry Whitaker in there. So if anybody wants those references, I'm happy to provide them. Outside of our community, I wanted to get a sense of the Jewish perspective of this topic. So I'd like to share a quote from a man called Moses Maimonides, who lived from 1135 to 1204 AD. He was a preeminent medieval Jewish philosopher, rabbi, and physician. Maimonides was born in Spain. He later settled in Egypt, where he became the leader of the Jewish community in Cairo. So he had a lot of interactions with Christians, certainly Jews, Arabs, Muslims. He was best known for his magnum opus, Guide to the Perplexed. So this was a philosophical treatise that sought to reconcile Jewish teachings with some of the Greek philosophy, other intellectual traditions of his time. So you can see an ancient depiction of him teaching, sorry about that, and then more recently a Israeli shekel note with his depiction on it. I think that was from the 60s. I don't know if he's still on the shekel note or not. So quoting from that text that I mentioned, the Guide for the Perplexed, he's very interested in this question of man being made in God's image and likeness. And so he first acknowledges the objections of people who take these depictions of God's arm, his eyes, his ears, as being very literal, as God being having a form, having ears, eyes, feet, all these things. So he says, some have been of the opinion that by the Hebrew Zalem, the shape and the figure of a thing is to be understood, and this explanation led men to believe in the corporeality, there's that word again, corporeality of the divine being. They adhered faithfully to this view and thought that if they were to relinquish it, they would, by that very act, reject the truth of the Bible, and further, if they did not conceive God as having a body possessed of face and limbs similar to their own in appearance, they would have to deny even the existence of God. The sole difference which they admitted was that he excelled in greatness and splendor, and that his substance was not flesh and blood. You can see there a reference to 1 Corinthians 15, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom. But he's talking about the sort of people that see, Isaiah 65, heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool, and think literally this is talking about God being seated somewhere in the heavens. Let's see here. So he goes on to offer his understanding. So he acknowledges the one perspective, and he offers another. As man's distinction consists in a property which no other creature on earth possesses, namely his intellectual perception, in the exercise of which he does not employ his senses nor move his hand or his foot. So he's talking about something that's happening in our brain, our intellectual perception, that is not related to other brain functions, right? So the functions you need to eat or to go somewhere, he's saying that's sort of the ordinary thing that even animals have, right? Clearly animals are, he's looking for a distinction, something that sets man apart from every other creature of the earth. And recall from 2 weeks ago, we said, image and likeness that man bears, that was unique in creation. Only of humankind did God say, let us make man in our image and likeness. So what's the distinguishing thing about mankind? He says it's this intellectual perception. This perception has been compared, though only apparently not in truth, to the divine perception, which requires no corporeal organ. So I think, again, the point here is you could be, to be a little bit crude, you could be a paraplegic. You could have total loss of your nervous system and still have a functioning, bright, active inner life. You don't necessarily need to have a body or control over bodily functions to have this intellectual perception he's talking about. So on this account, in other words, on account of the divine intellect with which man has been endowed, he is said to have been made in the form and likeness of the Almighty. But again, far be it from us that the notion of the supreme being is corporeal, having a material form. So he's very much against the idea of God having a body the way that we would conceive of corporeal form. So I think the point here is apt. No chimpanzee has ever written poetry, right? Or solved for X in an algebraic equation. And more significantly, animals don't think about divine things. They don't have the capacity for spiritual thoughts. So his argument is that intellectual perception, the ability to conceive of God and to think of higher things than what do I eat, where do I get rest, how can I escape my enemies or predators, that's what distinguishes man from the animals. So yeah, I think that criteria does meet. It is something that distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom. I do wonder how much, being a Jewish philosopher and observing the growth of Christianity, maybe some of Maimonides' perspectives might have been influenced by the fact that the Trinitarian dogma was being put forward, which says that God showed up in human form. And so as a Jew, he would have been opposed to that. But the nominal reason given for this view is that the Jewish audience had this prohibition on graven images, which is a huge part of their identity, right? That they were not to serve idols. So in kind of basic terms, you might have thought of this, like God told us not to make graven images because he can't be represented by physical things. So that's true, right? God did tell them not to make graven images. He is not to be represented by idols and sculptures or things formed by hand. And he can't be represented by... I think that's why he wants us to represent him in our characters, right? If we say that God can be adequately represented by this statue or this carved thing I chiseled, that's what God is, right? Like the golden calf, right? This is the God that brought you out of Egypt. Well, no, it's not. The God that brought you out of Egypt is holy and righteous and true and all these other characteristics that the calf doesn't tell you anything about. And so for humankind, this is like spoiler alert a little bit, but I think the whole idea with bearing God's image and likeness is that we are supposed to be representing his character. We're supposed to be manifesting God through our words and our actions, our behaviors, having been influenced by the mind of the Spirit. And that really any sort of representation in physical terms, right, a picture of God or it's just inadequate. It's not enough. So there's part of what he's saying here that I think kind of makes sense, but I'll leave it to you to kind of decide where you land on some of these questions. Any questions or comments?
Image and likeness was, we do have that capability to worship God and to think like him, like you said, the animals don't. And, natural man will go on his own instinct, right? When God is describing in Daniel the nations, right? They're beasts, right? They go on their own natural, feed themselves, natural, when we say, my gut tells me it's probably wrong, right? So we're supposed to be godlike thinking. And that's when we can take in the word and that's the only way we're going to develop that character of God that we, like you said, that's what we're supposed to be doing. That's what God wanted, right?
Yeah. So I figured while we were on this topic of kind of, does God have a bodily form and all these questions, which the more we talk about this, I think we're kind of concluding, hey, maybe that's a secondary issue. Maybe the real issue is like exhibiting God's character, and that's where our focus should be. But as long as the question's open about, does he have a form? Does he take up space? These sorts of abstract, more philosophical than theological questions in some ways. Okay, so the Jews were prohibited from making images of God, but they weren't forbidden to write about him. So in Ezekiel, we do see that, Ezekiel saw something, right? He had a vision of something, and that something was supposed to be God, and God is described as having a human appearance and likeness. You think about the description of God in Daniel, where Daniel encounters the Ancient of Days. I think it describes his eyes are like fire, and his hair is like wool or something like that. Right, so he's seeing some depiction of what God looks like. If they had just taken those written words and kind of translated into like a visual representation, it would have been violating what God had told them to do. But it was okay for them to write about what God looked like. So is this what God looks like, what they're writing, or was this how God appeared to them? Again, the way he appears to us, talking about his arm and his eyes. Kind of speaking to us in a more of a symbolic way, and are we supposed to understand something in symbol from the way the prophets saw God? I just wanted to share something kind of interesting, as long as we're talking about sort of the Jewish perspective here. In the Talmud, it says, "I saw the Lord," right? So this is I believe that the Talmud is the oral Torah, which was kind of handed down word of mouth until one day they decide, hey, we need to write this down. We need a written record of this, or it's going to get corrupted, right? So the Talmud is that written record, which I think was like in the 3rd century or something like that, after Christ. So I saw the Lord is to be understood as is taught in the oral Torah. All of the prophets observed their prophecies through an obscure looking glass. And there's a word used here which is borrowed from the Greek. It's obviously in the Hebrew Torah. This obscure looking glass. It's a special kind of word here. Their prophecies were given as metaphoric visions, but were not a direct perception of the matter. However, Moses, our master, observed his prophecies through a clear looking glass. He gained a direct and accurate perception of the matter. So the idea of the looking glass is a mirror. It's a reflecting glass that you can see reflection through. So is this ringing a bell for anybody? This idea of an obscure looking glass, and but Moses saw clearly. Is that any echoes? Ringing any bells? Yes, that's the one that I thought of, and I didn't even I totally found this thing in the Talmud without starting at that point. So I was like, this is ringing a bell here. There's some connection. And it's to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Writing to Corinth, Paul states, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then shall I know fully, even as I have been fully known." And I can't help but wonder if this is something that Paul had encountered at some point in his training as a Pharisee, that he had heard this idea of the prophets getting a glimpse of God, but not a full picture, just some sort of a dim, like you're looking through a glass that has, like my truck right now, it's covered in salt. I can't really see out of it. The backup camera, I was like trying to get into my spot. It's like, I don't think I'm going to hit anything. But we don't have the full picture right now, but we do expect to at some point in the future. The comment from the Torah is that Moses really had an encounter with God that was unlike any of the other prophets, that he saw God more clearly than anybody who followed him. So the verse I want to go to is in Deuteronomy chapter 34 in verse 10. there's not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. I think that's where, when it says our master Moses observed his prophecies through a clear looking glass, I think it's a reference to this idea from Deuteronomy 34 that really there wasn't anybody like Moses with whom God spoke. I don't think this comment in Deuteronomy 34 makes sense for Moses himself to have included, right? Moses wrote the Pentateuch, but the Pentateuch also includes Moses' death, so clearly there were some editorial additions over time. So the editor in this case is making the comment that there has not risen a prophet since Moses, right? So Ezekiel and Daniel perhaps included among them. Let me share another one. When Aaron and Miriam oppose Moses, right, there's that rebellion. God calls them out in the tent of meeting. I'm going to start a little earlier than what's on screen. Numbers chapter 12, verse 5. The Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam. They both came forward, and he said, "Hear my words, if there's a prophet among you. I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream." Right? So I will speak to a prophet. But I speak to Moses differently. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. He doesn't get the vision or the dream. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly and not in riddles. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? Really interesting, this word that's translated riddles. It's the same word that's translated enigma in 1 Corinthians 13. Do I have it on the screen? I think it's the word dimly in the ESV. Now we see in a mirror dimly. It's this, in the Greek version of the Old Testament, it's the word that I don't speak to Moses in riddles. I don't speak to him dimly. He beholds the form of the Lord. So there's another connection there. So clearly Moses has a different experience of God than anyone that followed him. So another example of this is in Exodus 33. Remember, before they had the tabernacle, they had the tent of meeting. So it was a different tent that Moses would go into. Read when Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak to Moses. Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. Right, so the way you speak to your friends, you can imagine your friend's face and their reactions to what you're saying, and kind of the intimacy of a face-to-face conversation. Right, in the Zoom era, it's like, okay, I can talk to my coworkers or something on Zoom, right? But if they're in the same building as me, like I might just go to their desk so we can have a face-to-face conversation because it's closer, right? It's more meaningful in some ways. You just don't get that through a less direct form of communication. And that's what God's saying about his interaction with Moses. He spoke to him face to face. The kind of intriguing thing here is that in the same chapter, God says, "You cannot see my face and live." Let's pull that up. So the context almost forces you to kind of grapple with this issue. What does it mean he spoke to Moses face to face, and then he says later, "You can't see my face," right? If you speak to God the way that man speaks to his friend, well, when you speak to your friend, usually you can see their face. That's a big part of like this common interaction that we have. So the Keel and Delitzsch commentary says that, what's it say, Ben? The words are transferred anthropomorphically from man to God. So the idea is anthropomorphos is like man changing. It's applying traits that belong to mankind to other things. Because human language and human thought can only conceive of the nature of the absolute spirit according to the analogy of the human form, as the inward nature of man manifests itself in his face, and the sight of his back gives only an imperfect and outward view of him, So Moses saw only the back and not the face of Jehovah, or Yahweh. So this is where God says, you can't see my face and live. I'll show you my back. And so, the sense here is, even Moses, with as intimate of a relationship as he had with God, he wasn't seeing the fullness of God's glory. He was experiencing it in part, to some extent. I hope that makes sense. So when it says he speaks to Moses face to face, that's still an idiomatic expression, because I think it's in 1 Timothy it says that no man can see God and live, right? And God says that to Moses in this very same chapter. So speaking to him face to face as a man speaks to his friend it's still an idiom for very close communication, but Moses didn't actually see the face of God. Yeah. I agree with that. That makes sense to me. Any other perspectives? Any conflicting opinions?
But I think God shifts his form to help me understand.
Oh, the people online want to hear you.
But I think God shifts his form, like he was in a
Right.
cloud. He showed parts of his body, to help men understand. He has to speak to us in a way that we're going to understand or perceive him, to try to interpret that, to understand how to follow him and what he's trying to tell us. And I think of when Moses shined after he spoke with God. I don't think any of the other prophets did, if you think about it, right? We don't hear of them, their faces glowing when they came down from talking to God. So that's what that special relationship is too. Like, that's how close God was to him and how he interacted with him.
Yeah, that's a good connection, getting to the face of Moses.
Yeah, Moses shining.
Think about
To be that close to God, like God came down. That's what that face-to-face was, that intimate conversation that was had. There was no confusion in that conversation to trick him. Or he wanted everyone to understand what he wanted the people to do and how to worship him.
Yeah. I don't know. The only other one I can think of is Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. Right? Let's see. All right, so let's wrap this up. There's a reference in Timothy if you want it. Whom no one has ever seen or can see. So just to summarize, right, we have holy men in the Old Testament who saw representations of God in some form. Ezekiel, Daniel. Even in the book of Exodus, you have Aaron and the 70 elders of Israel who go like part way up the mountain, right? And it says that they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was a pavement of sapphire. It says they beheld God in Exodus chapter 24. So in some sense, Aaron and the elders saw God. But it wasn't the fullness of the experience that Moses experienced. We didn't really get into Exodus 33 and 34 too much, where Moses asked God to show him his glory and his ways. And God says, I can't show you my face. Moses asked to see his glory. So his glory is actually proclaimed in Exodus chapter 34, where he reveals his name to Moses, and his name is associated with his character. And so this kind of comes full circle to what we were talking about at the beginning, where it's really God's character that we should be more concerned about. This whole question of God's form, does he take up physical space, all these things, it's sort of secondary, in my mind anyway. Although Moses did have a very close relationship with God, he didn't see God's face fully. But in whatever sense that God may be seen, this is part of our hope, right? We'll just have to go through these verses very quickly, but we already saw 1 Corinthians 13 that there is a hope to encounter God face to face in the future. In the Beatitudes, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Hebrews 12, strive for peace and for holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. So again, character attributes that are required to fully encounter God. And then in Revelation, God's servants will see his face and his name will be on their foreheads. So in whatever sense we're supposed to understand seeing the face of God, and maybe it is the fullness of his character in complete holiness and uprightness. Maybe there is some physical form or way that we will, with our eyes, see God. We do tend to look at the natural and then elevate the spiritual, but there's usually is a real natural undergirding to a lot of these lessons that we learn. So maybe there is a less than spiritual sense that we'll encounter God. But for now, our present concern should be with God's name bearing. So when we think about bearing God's image and likeness, I think the direction that we want to go with this is in the spiritual sense of God's moral uprightness, his righteousness. So God willing, next week we'll take this into the New Testament where we see Jesus Christ, who is called the image, the complete, Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3. I don't want to misquote it. But basically, the sense of Jesus being the perfect representation of his Father, the way that we are to be. Being the brightness of his glory, the express image of his person, and upholding all things by his word. So Jesus as the express image, the perfect representation of his Father. So that's it.